Well, basically, if I am just going to tell you what the SHARDS is about on a very basic level, it's about a group of high school students. They go to a very prestigious prep school in LA called the Buckley School. It's a private school. They're all fairly wealthy. There's about 5 or 6 of them that the book concentrates on. A new student arrives, and one of the other students, the narrator of the book, is automatically suspicious of him. There's something off about this new guy. And our narrator becomes convinced that he is somehow connected, that this new guy is somehow connected to a serial killer that has begun operating in the San Fernando Valley, called the Trawler. And our narrator, who is one of these kids, begins to piece together all of these clues about this new boy and is positive that he is the serial killer. Now, also going on is this rather large teenage drama, relationship drama. People are breaking up. It does have a lot of tropes of the traditional high school novel. There's the golden couple. There's the closeted jock. There's the druggy rich girl. And there's the narrator who is closeted and has a girlfriend and is the one who is fantasizing about the new boy being this serial killer. And that is the engine of the novel. And the serial killer, the Trawler, seems to be getting closer and closer to this group of friends. And Bret, the narrator, is convinced that one of their classmates has in fact been killed by the Trawler in a kind of ritualistic, kind of cult-like slaying, but it is being presented to the school and to everyone as an accident, that he slipped, he fell in the pool, he tried to gash his arm, but in fact, it was all part of a ritualistic murder. And so anyway, and it's also about 1980 because I said it the year that I went to high school. And it's about Los Angeles in that era. It's about the clubs we went to. It's about the movie theaters and the malls. And it's kind of a historical fiction about LA. But at the same time, it is being, a lot of people talk about it as if it's a slasher horror, teen horror novel with a serial killer looming larger and larger as the book moves forward. But my main impulse was right about my time as a teenager, as a 17-year-old in high school, and what that was like.
Could you take us back to, especially for the young listeners, who probably don't have any more references than a couple of 80s movies. How was the 80s in Los Angeles? Can you describe a day for the character?
Well, I have to tell you, first of all, that we're talking about the end of the 70s and we're talking about the very dawn of the 80s. The book takes place in 81, which is a very different year than the mid-80s, than the John Hughes 80s. 81 is really still the 70s, and it really wasn't until Ronald Reagan became president and the fashion started changing because of MTV. MTV had a big impact on fashion, and this was pre-MTV. So the SHARDS is still kind of in the 70s. It is 81, but the kids don't have, the boys don't have mullets, and there's no shoulder pads, and the girls don't have the crazy frizzy hair that so many of the women had in the mid 80s. So it is, I just want to preface this by saying that it was very, very different from, I think, the cliched idea that we have of the 80s from certain movies from that decade. So the SHARDS has nothing like that. But I think you're asking about what was an average day like for a teenager at that time?
Yeah.
Well, we didn't have a phone. We woke up and we looked at our clock. We looked at our clock, and maybe we picked up a book. Maybe we laid there. I don't know. I've gotten a lot of flack for having so much sex in this book, But there is, and both with men and women and with boys and boys, and there's a lot of masturbation. There's a lot of jerking off in this book because it's narrated by a 17-year-old guy, and some critics have complained about this and have said there is way too much masturbation in this book, way too much sexual fantasy. I'm sorry, at 17. I think I downplayed it in this book, actually. Mm-hmm. And if you're going to have a book narrated by a 17-year-old guy and have it be authentic and have it be true, you're going to have to add that in. So, it was simpler. It was a more free life. You had a freer life than I think you have now. Mm. You weren't told what to say. You weren't told what to do necessarily in terms of ideology, in terms of language, and having to be careful about jokes. We wanted to be offended. We loved dirty movies. We loved things like Blue Velvet, which would never be made today. We wanted to be challenged and shocked. That is what we wanted. Mm. We liked being offended, which of course today can't do any of that today. So it was a very different vibe in terms of freedom.
Yeah.
Freedom. It was, and I think I was reminded, I wanted to write this book 40 years ago when I was 18, when all of this stuff was happening to me, and I couldn't figure it out. I didn't have the talent for it at 18 or 19. And I do think part of the reason that it started stirring within me in the last 3 or 4 years was the nostalgia that time was better. That 2020 was an awful year, and 2021 was an awful year. And even the years preceding that were pretty awful. I don't know. I think maybe the awfulness of those years was what made me go back to 1981, when it was pretty great. It was a lot better. But anyway, so the average day, I don't know. We were mobile. We had cars. You had to have a car as a teenager in LA. Cheap car, nice car, whatever. You needed a car. And so you got your cars in LA at 15 and a half. That's when you got your learner's permit. So you were driving at 16. And you wanted to be an adult. You wanted to be an adult. You didn't want to cosplay at Comic-Con for the rest of your life and just sit around playing Final Fantasy 17 for 18 hours. You wanted to become an adult and enter into the world of sex, relationships, career, because you were living in an adult world made by adults for adults. There was no kiddie land around. There was not like 80 Disney movies opening. There was not helicoptering parents. There was not people telling you can't say this, you can't do that. That's a bad word, honey. No one asks, oh, what do you want for dinner? Or are you feeling okay? Or whatever. It wasn't that way. It was an adult world. And because of that, we grew up faster. And I think that it was a huge difference between now and then. We weren't walking on eggshells. I mean, I would find it terrifying to be a young person or a teenager now. Maybe not terrifying, but still there would be something about me as a young artist, because I was a writer then, that I would feel constricted. I would feel somewhat censored. I don't think I could publish or write the things that I wanted to write about, or that I did write about in my high school days, and have it be accepted.
Is it easier and more stimulating to write from eras where we didn't have the internet or the mobile phone, back in the days when there's not so much technology noise in the social situations?
I guess so. I mean, I don't know. That's not why I wrote the book, and that's not one of the reasons why I was attracted to even writing the book. But I did have a conversation with Quentin Tarantino, who loved the Shards. And he said to me, you were doing the same thing that I did with Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. You don't want to write about where we are now, do you? Because it sucks, right? And I said, yeah, I guess so. You want to write about your childhood like I did with Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. And I said, yeah, I guess I did. He said, I want to write about that moment when I was a child and the Manson family, that fucking cult scared the hell out of me. It really traumatized all of us growing up in LA, the Manson murders. And I think Quentin, in his way, with Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, felt a way how to resolve it or process it. And he also said to me, and didn't it feel so fucking good that you didn't have to have a fucking cell phone in the Shards? That's how I felt with Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. God, wasn't that so freeing? And I said, I guess now that you mention it, it was. So you're right. Yes, the cell phone. I mentioned this in the Shards in a scene where the main character goes to see The Shining the weekend it opens in Westwood. And he goes there early. It's an early morning show. It just opened in May. I remember this because I talk about the opening of The Shining, the Stanley Kubrick movie, on May 24th, 1980. And I remember going to that theater, and I wanted to go to the 10 a.m. showing because it was only opening in 3 theaters in LA, an exclusive engagement before opening wider a month or 2 later. That's how a lot of movies open. And I was afraid the 1 o'clock or the 4 o'clock were going to be way too crowded. So I drove to the 10 a.m. and I got there at 9:30, parked in an empty parking lot in Westwood, bought my ticket, went into the theater. The movie was starting for about 20 minutes, and I sat there. I looked at the screen. I didn't have a phone or anything. It was 1980. I didn't have a phone. Looked at the screen. I thought about my life. I thought about the boy I liked. I looked up at the vaulted ceiling. It was really beautiful. I always loved this theater. Looked around to see how many people had come in. Oh, it was about half filled. Okay, yeah, it's an early morning show. I looked at my box of Junior Mints, and I had one. And I just took in the theater and thought about my life and school on Monday. And I purposefully had the scene in the Shards as a reminder of how different things are. He says in it, and I can't believe writing this now. I just sat there for 20 minutes without a phone and just thought about my life and the world.
And doing that now, people would freak out if their battery on the phone is out.
Of course. I would freak out. I would freak out. I am the age I am. I'm 58. But the last thing I look at before I go to bed is that phone. The first thing I look at in the morning is the phone. Now, I am not on it as much as my boyfriend is, who's on it far more often. He's connected to it in a way that I'm not. I was not. He's been connected with it longer as technology has been a bigger part. The digital age has been a much bigger part of his life than it has with mine. I'm part analog, still an analog guy in a lot of ways, much more than he will ever be.